This is a new talk for me. I talk about New Jersey and the Civil War a lot, and I talk about the Civil War a lot, but I still went ahead and for these two sessions have written a completely new material because I've been wanting to write about this topic. As I said, I think I have something kind of new and different to say. I hope, in fact, that the lecture that the library is sponsoring will eventually be kind of revised and published as an article. So we'll see how that goes, and I'll be interested in your reaction to it as we go. I do want to thank Samantha Sullivan. She's not here. She's my research assistant. She actually graduated and is in the graduate program now, but she did some of the research that helped me write this paper tonight. So one of my titles for this potential article is New Jersey, Jersey Blue or Traitor State. The role of New Jersey in the Civil War is a fascinating topic, and it's not simply, I think, fascinating just for natives or residents of New Jersey, but I think it's interesting for everyone who cares about the American Civil War. New Jersey occupies a unique position as the only free state to vote against Lincoln in both 1860 and 1864. Yet, of course, it supported the Union and made tremendous sacrifices of blood and treasure in a war, fighting for a man that they did not vote for. Early historians of New Jersey in the Civil War, such as Charles Knapp, emphasized one half of the equation, focusing on New Jersey's democratic government and its resistance to the war effort. And in doing so, Knapp concluded that New Jersey was similar to the border slave states and in its ambivalence to the war. But more recent historians, and I think persuasively, especially William Gillette, have turned this analysis on its head. And they have focused on those who supported the Union during the war and concluded that New Jersey was actually a little different than the other free states. Well, not surprisingly, as you might guess, I believe the actual answer lies somewhere in between. And there's just a map of New Jersey in the 19th century and a political map of the United States, which, if you could see it more clearly, divides up the United States into free and slave states. And that's how, prior to the Civil War, that's how the newspapers and politicians divided up the country into free and slave states. As you know, when the Civil War begins, there will be actually 4 slave states that will remain in the Union, loyal slave states. 11 of those 15 will go to the Confederacy, but not all. But prior to Fort Sumter, it was the free and slave states. There is a copy of a couple of the books. In fact, I brought Professor Gillette's book. This is it, Jersey Blue. And there's an old cover from 1924 of Charles Knapp's book. There hasn't really been very much written about New Jersey. I think there is room for more about this important state. What I'm going to do, however, to begin is to actually talk about slavery in New Jersey. I think that most of us know that the causes of the Civil War are tied inextricably to slavery. That doesn't necessarily mean that soldiers who volunteered in 1861 were fighting to end slavery or to protect slavery in the South. That's a different question. Why soldiers fight is different than why wars begin. But it's pretty clear, I think, to most historians that slavery is a big part of it. If we want to understand New Jersey and how New Jersey interacted on this issue, I think it's important to start and look at the history of slavery in New Jersey. New Jersey, like every British colony, was home to African slaves at the time of the American Revolution. What happened to African slavery during and after the Revolution, however, differed greatly from state to state and was the source of division even in the first years of the American Republic. Indeed, the issue of slavery was a major source of conflict and compromise at the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Northerners successfully banned the word slave and slavery from the Constitution, and Southerners successfully included protections for the African slave trade, provisions for a Fugitive Slave Act, and the infamous 3/5 Clause. And show you a couple of slides here about some of the things I've been saying. Here's the census from 1860, and it has the free population, the slave population, and the percentage of slaves. If you look, South Carolina has 57% of its population was enslaved in 1860. More slaves than free people in South Carolina. South Carolina is the first state to secede from the United States. The first 7 states that formed the Confederacy, the Deep South states, were South Carolina, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, and Texas. Texas departs a little bit. It's all the way down at 9 in terms of its percentage of slavery, but it actually was one of the first 7 to join. My argument, native Texan, I think I'm pretty confident on this. The reason why Texas is number 9 is because it's a new state, only recently settled. Slaveholders have only been moving into Texas, only been part of the United States since 1845. It would have been in the top 7 if there would have been another decade of settlement. The next 4 states, North Carolina, Virginia, Arkansas, and Tennessee, those are the 4 states that joined the Confederacy after Fort Sumter. And the last 4 states in the slave states, Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, and Delaware, well, they happen to be the 4 slave states that never joined the Confederacy. Now, you can ask yourself, is it pure coincidence that it falls along these lines, right? That the first states to join the Confederacy, the most loyal states to the Confederacy, had the highest percentage of slave population, that the first ones to join after Fort Sumter were the next 4, and that the ones that never joined had the lowest percentage of the slave population. I would argue this is not coincidence. There is some level of causality here. So this leads me to think that we need to understand why New Jersey isn't on this list. Because New Jersey did have slavery, but it's not on this list in 1860. Here are the approximate number of African slaves in early New Jersey, actually going all the way up to 1860. You can see a few at the very beginning of the settlement, actually right from the very beginning of English settlers here. By the onset of the American Revolution, over 8,000. That increased a little bit by the time of the first census in 1790. Started going down and decreased rapidly after 1810. In 1860, there were 18. They actually weren't slaves. They were lifetime apprentices at that point in time. But there were 18 that were still in the census as listed as slaves. Yes, ma'am?
Why did that happen, that they went down?
We're going to get to that. That's coming up. That's coming up. I promise we'll get to that. If you don't have to, this is a lot of information that you don't need to know necessarily. You know, I just decided I would throw up some statistics for you. This is African slavery in northern New Jersey. What I just wanted to show you is that this is 1790, the first census. You'll see that New Jersey in the north, the northern states have 10,000 slaves, over 10,000 out of almost 12,000 total blacks. Many more slaves than free blacks in 1790 in North Jersey. And if you look at South Jersey, you'll see that's not the same case at all. There are only less than 1,000 slaves in southern New Jersey, and there are more free blacks than slaves in South Jersey. And of course, many of you probably know the reason for that, and it has a lot to do with the Quaker population of southern New Jersey at the time. All right. Now, I did mention the Constitutional Convention, and I want to go back and forth between national issues and kind of local issues if I can. So I want to go back to the Constitutional Convention. Most folks know the Constitutional Convention, and kind of the famous situation was the small states versus the big states on a course of apportionment. That was a controversy, and it didn't matter. Probably mattered more to New Jersey than did the controversy over slavery. But you would be wrong if you did not think slavery was a big deal at the Constitutional Convention of 1787. It absolutely mattered, especially the South Carolinians and especially the New Englanders. New Englanders were already clearly on the way to getting rid of slavery. In fact, they already had gotten rid of slavery. And South Carolinians were very worried about what it was going to be like to be in a union with free states. They already had an episode in which South Carolina slaves during the Revolution, they got up to Massachusetts. Massachusetts had put them in jail, had a whole Supreme Court case about what to do with them, and then let them go. That did not make South Carolinians happy. Not at all. So they were interested in some protections in the Constitution. That's William Patterson, my favorite delegate of New Jersey to the Constitutional Convention. He is considered the father of the Senate. He was primarily interested in that issue, protecting the rights of small states, not so much slavery. He's most famous whenever they were trying to approve James Madison's Virginia plan, which had representation by population and no Senate. When they asked how would New Jersey vote on the plan, he would stand up and say, "New Jersey votes never!" And eventually they caved and added the Senate for Patterson. Like most New Jerseyans, he cared more about that issue than slavery. It was really the South Carolinians and the New Englanders that cared the most about it. Still, their caring about the issue led to these compromises on slavery. The 3/5 clause, infamous. What it means is sometimes lost on people because it was actually Southerners who wanted to count slaves as 5/5, right? They wanted to count them as whole people. It was New Englanders that didn't want to count slaves because in doing so, you gave the South more representation in Congress. In fact, the 3/5 clause is one of the most important and consequential clauses in the Constitution because without it, Thomas Jefferson does not become president in 1800. And in my opinion, the election of 1800 is second only in importance to the election of 1860 as the most important in our history. Without the 3/5 clause, Jefferson does not become president. Adams gets a second term. The history of the United States, I think, would be different. The fugitive slave clause, obviously that's something South Carolina really wanted after their experience. Prohibition on congressional regulation of the Atlantic slave trade until 1808. South Carolina desperately wanted to keep the slave trade open for another 20 years. If not, they worried that Congress would in fact end the slave trade. And in fact, they're absolutely right about it. Congress is not allowed to do it until January 1st, 1808. The date that Congress outlaws the slave trade is January the 1st, 1808. And they would have outlawed it earlier if they could have, but South Carolina made sure that they could not. The North did get the removal of the word slave from the Constitution. They did not want that word, contaminating their beautiful document. So if you look in the 3/5 clause, it says 3/5 of all other persons. It doesn't say slaves. Okay. Now let's get back to New Jersey. All right, so what's New Jersey's situation with regard to slavery? It's not New England, but it's clearly not South Carolina either. In the decades that followed the Constitutional Convention, a pattern grew up that showed New Jersey to be rather moderate on the issue of slavery. Like other northern states, they passed a gradual Emancipation Act. New Jersey, however, was the last of what would become known as the free states to do so, passing their legislation in 1804, 24 years after their eastern neighbor, Pennsylvania. Yet New Jersey's relatively late emancipation still puts the state far in advance of their southern neighbor, Delaware. Not significantly more dependent upon slave labor than New Jersey, Delaware nevertheless maintained legal slavery until after the Civil War and voted against the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Delaware only grudgingly embraced emancipation in December 1865, 8 months after the Civil War had ended, and after the amendment became law over their negative vote, in spite of their opposition. So you can say that New Jersey was the last, and you can kind of, be critical of New Jersey for that. But I would say, well, New Jersey didn't become Delaware, and therefore it's somewhere, it should be given credit in the end of becoming one of the free states, even if it was last. Why did New Jersey pass a gradual emancipation law when Delaware did not? This is a critical question because in passing this law, New Jersey chose to side with the North and what set itself up into the free slave state dichotomy. It meant, for example, just think about what would happen if New Jersey had not, if New Jersey had gone the way of Delaware. The border between slavery and freedom would have gone all the way up to New York City. It would have been scant miles actually from Connecticut, from New England, right? It would have been quite a different map of slavery and freedom if New Jersey, small state though it is, had actually not passed this act. It's actually only 25 miles or so between Connecticut and some parts of New Jersey. New Jersey's decision for emancipation may be ascribed to several factors, but the actions of particular anti-slavery leaders in the state, at least to me as an outsider, seems central. Chief among these figures is John Woolman of Mount Holly. Okay. Woolman was a Quaker minister who believed that slavery was incompatible with Christianity and began preaching against slavery and the slave trade as early as the 17th. An influential anti-slavery tract entitled Some Considerations on the Keeping of Negroes. After his death, Woolman's journal was published and became one of the most influential books ever written by an American religious figure. Designated a Harvard classic and republished continually, the Journal of John Woolman not only spurred emancipation in the North, but influenced foreign observers to oppose the slave trade and is even credited with leading Tsar Alexander II to emancipate the serfs in Russia. A brief reading from an entry about the slave trade will give you some sense of Woolman's beliefs and the reason he is credited by the antebellum abolitionists, who are more famous than he is, as well as their pro-slavery opponents, by the way, both, for different reasons, credit Woolman as being the apostle of abolition in the United States. And here is a quote from Woolman: "Where a trade is carried on productive of much misery, and they who suffer by it are some 1,000 miles off, the danger is the greater of not laying their sufferings to heart. In procuring slaves on the coast of Africa, many children are stolen privately. Wars are also encouraged amongst the Negroes, but all is at a great distance. Many groans arise from dying men, which we hear not. Many cries are uttered by widows and fatherless children, which reach not our ears. Many cheeks are wet with tears, and faces sad with unutterable grief, which we see not. Cruel tyranny is encouraged. The hands of robbers are strengthened, and thousands reduced to the most abject slavery who never injured us." Okay, this sounds like it could have been written by someone in the 20th or 21st century, this kind of sentiment. He was alone in this period of time. White abolitionists who traveled into the South, preaching against slavery, trying to convince slaveholders to free their slaves. And he was very influential among the Quakers for sure, but among others as well, as I've mentioned. He's not the only person in New Jersey, however, who I would credit with turning the state towards gradual emancipation. I would also give credit to this man, William Livingston, a Presbyterian, who was, of course, the Patriot governor of New Jersey during the Revolution, a close confidant of George Washington. He's slept supposedly never in the same bed twice out of fear of being kidnapped by the British agents in New Jersey. Livingston is a fantastic figure, but people don't know about his anti-slavery beliefs. Livingston in 1778 urged the General Assembly to make provisions for the manumission of slaves. He then set his own slaves free and declared that idolizing liberty while holding slaves was both odious and disgraceful, and he urged the state of New Jersey to follow his example. In 1786, New Jersey did, passing and restricting an act on the slave trade and making it easy to manumit slaves, or at least easier. Still, it wasn't gradual emancipation completely. That took another 18 years. But eventually, after a campaign of petitions to the legislature, the Assembly passed the Gradual Emancipation Act. And I should point out here that there were many groups, not just these famous individuals, that formed anti-slavery societies in Salem, in Burlington, in Trenton, throughout New Jersey during this period to petition the government and push this issue forward, finally succeeding in 1804. After it passed this Gradual Emancipation Act, and I'll just give you some of the details for it here, it said that female slaves born after July 4th, 1804 would be free at 21 years old, and male slaves would be free at age 25. And that was very typical of Gradual Emancipation Acts at the time. It's not going to be a radical overturning of slavery, but it does put slavery on the road to extinction in New Jersey. Okay. All right, following the Gradual Emancipation Act, you might wonder, well, how does New Jersey then interact with the sectional issues that arise between the North and the South? Does it side with the South? Does it side with the North? Is it consistent in its free state kind of beliefs? And the answer is yes, it does continue to be so. Here are a couple of the key moments in the sectional crisis in Congress. In 1819, there's the Missouri crisis. That's when Missouri wants to come in as a slave state. For the first time in the history of the United States, the votes in Congress are completely along sectional lines. Every Southerner votes against the amendment requiring Missouri to pass a Gradual Emancipation Act, and every Northerner votes for this amendment. New Jersey votes for requiring Missouri to free its slaves before coming in. So New Jersey is in line with the free states in this regard. That doesn't happen. They come up with a compromise. Missouri does come in as a slave state. Maine comes in a free state, and they pass a line, 36 degrees 30 minutes. Slavery can go south, but not north of this line. But the key thing is that New Jersey is on the side of the other free states. This man here is David Wilmot. He's a freshman. He was a freshman legislator from Pennsylvania in 1846 in a bill asking for money for soldiers in the U.S.-Mexican War, David Wilmot says, Mexico has outlawed slavery, and if we happen to maybe acquire any territory from Mexico in this war, we should have a law that says that you cannot allow slavery into this territory. Made sense to every Northerner, including New Jerseyans. They voted for the Wilmot Proviso. Every Southerner voted against the Wilmot Proviso. Okay? So once again, New Jersey shows itself to be in line with the other free states. This pattern continues for the most part during the 1850s. I'm not going to go into all these national events in great detail, but New Jerseyans, like other Northerners, hate the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which repeals the Missouri Compromise line, allows slavery to go north of that line. Like other Northerners, New Jerseyans think that the Dred Scott decision is wrong, not so much because Dred Scott is returned to slavery, but because among the things that Taney says in that decision is that you could never pass the Missouri Compromise. It was not constitutional when it was in force, and you can never go back to it, which a lot of people in New Jersey and other Northerners wanted to do. Other things about it frustrated them as well. And of course, John Brown. Most New Jerseyans, like most Northerners, did not approve of his acts of violence, his attack on Harper's Ferry, yet at the same time, many Southerners were much more upset with Brown than were New Jerseyans. So they're similar to the free states during this period. Not nearly as radical as New England, but not, I think, the same as southern states or even the border states during this period. That said, it is true that New Jersey drifts a little bit more towards the Democratic column in the 1850s. The reason for this is because of the immigration of lots of Irish Catholics into the urban areas in North Jersey. Of course, you know the potato famine is at work, and lots of Irish are moving into the United States in this time. And the Irish come in, and they are largely Democratic. They have no love for black people. They have no real particular hatred of slavery, and the machine politics that exists are democratic machine politics. And it is also true that a lot of New Jerseyans at this time in the Protestant denominations are at least somewhat nativist and discriminatory against the Irish. So there's a lot of reasons why they gravitate to the Democratic Party, but what it means is that New Jersey is tilting a little bit further away from its position in the 1840s and 1830s, a little bit more supportive of pro-Southern candidates, although it does not go so far as to be, sympathetic to the Kansas-Nebraska Act or Dred Scott or any of those kinds of things. All right, let's move on and get to the election of 1860. Okay, so I wanted to do some background. I think it's important to understand kind of how New Jersey came to where it is. I think it's important to understand that how it became a free state and all that kind of stuff. But ultimately, the heart of the story is going to start now. We're going to slow down a little bit as we go through some of this. The events of the late antebellum period, particularly the Dred Scott decision and John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, had polarized the nation and turned the election of 1860 into the most important one in American history. A number of southern states had pledged to secede from the Union should the Republican candidate, Abraham Lincoln, be elected. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party was divided and could not unite behind a single candidate, as it had done in 1856 when they successfully elected James Buchanan. This was true both nationally and in New Jersey. Most, but not all, Northern Democrats supported Stephen Douglas of Illinois, who was deemed unacceptable by Southerners because of his support of anti-slavery settlers in Kansas. Southerners turned to John Breckinridge of Kentucky, who agreed with the Deep South politicians who argued that the federal government had no power to regulate slavery in any territory at any time. The radical position held by John C. Calhoun, but probably not 90% of Northerners. While most New Jerseyans could not support Breckinridge in this extreme position, many still hoped to avoid a Lincoln presidency. Worries about a Lincoln presidency were primarily rooted in fears that a Republican victory would trigger Southern secession, which would either lead to civil war or to a peaceful separation that would nonetheless critically damage New Jersey's economy, tied as it was to the South. Many New Jersey industrialists sold goods like shoes to Southerners. On August the 18th, 1860, the Newton Herald warned voters not to, quote, coolly and deliberately sanction the destruction of the American Union by aiding directly or indirectly the election of Abraham Lincoln. The fear of a decline in Southern trade was especially pronounced, as I said, in northern New Jersey, and it was there that opposition to Lincoln was the greatest. Here's a cartoon of the four candidates. There's Lincoln, Douglas, Breckinridge, all tearing up the United States map. And then if you see over there a little pitiful figure with some glue trying to hold it together is John Bell, a fourth candidate who entered the fray, trying to perhaps steal some electoral votes and force the election into the House of Representatives. Okay. In the end, New Jersey voted for Stephen Douglas, 62,000 votes to Lincoln's 58,000. There's the quote from the Herald that I read earlier. It appears that most New Jerseyans ended up siding with the Herald in not voting for Lincoln. But you should be aware, of course, that that's a lot of votes for Lincoln. I mean, even though he didn't win in New Jersey, it's not like he was drummed out of the race with no chance. By contrast, think about it this way. Kentucky, that's the state he was born in. He was born in Kentucky, right? He moved to Illinois, but he was born in Kentucky. His wife's family is from Kentucky. He had relatives in Kentucky. Do you know what percentage of the vote Lincoln got in the state he was born? 1%. Ralph Nader would have been ashamed. Right? 1% of the vote in the state that he was born. So the fact that he got, 47% here, this indicates that there are a lot of Lincoln supporters in New Jersey, even if New Jersey is the only state that voted against Lincoln. He actually ended up getting 4 electoral votes because the Democratic voters had their ballots messed up, and there was some confusion, and there was a lot of ballots that didn't count, and it ended up, because of this mistake, ended up giving Lincoln actually 4 of the 7 electoral votes in New Jersey. But that was more of a mistake by the Douglas forces than it was actually the New Jersey voters' wishes. And that wasn't known at the time when the election happened. It didn't happen until later when they discovered the ballots and everything. And by the time it was moot and all didn't matter. But okay. There's the overall election map from 1860. You'll see that although Lincoln only gets about 40% of the popular vote overall, he gets close to 60% of the Electoral College. And he is actually, truly is a nightmare for Southerners because, as you see, he didn't win, any states in the South at all, yet he still easily becomes president. Lincoln proves that you can become president of the United States as a purely sectional candidate. You don't need to run or win any votes in the South to be president. That's what Calhoun and many Southerners feared would be the case. The northern population advantage had gotten to this level. So they were not wrong to be afraid of this. After Lincoln was elected, South Carolina follows through on its pledge, and it does secede from the United States. Lincoln's greatest strength, by the way, can you guess which part of New Jersey Lincoln was the strongest in?
Newark.
Southern New Jersey. Southern New Jersey, right? Southern New Jersey. He won all but Camden County. Every other southern South Jersey county he won, and he only lost Camden County by a very thin margin. He got stomped in some of the northern counties. A lot of my ancestors, the Irish, voted against him. He won only 3 of the 10 northern counties. All right, let's move on to the secession crisis. In the months before Lincoln took office, 7 Deep South states seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. Several other states, including New Jersey, considered secession. In 1861, Rodman A. Price, who had been governor of New Jersey between 1854 and 1857, publicly proclaimed that New Jersey should abandon the Northern Confederacy and join our destiny with the South. All right, that's the former governor of New Jersey, not a marginal person of no significance. He says that New Jersey should leave and join the South. He commented favorably on the Confederate Constitution, proclaiming that indeed they were right, slavery was no sin. And he argued that joining the South would actually reunite the country, as Pennsylvania and New York would soon follow New Jersey's lead. Price's views were atypical, but hardly unique. In fact, a decade earlier, Senator Robert Stockton, another one of New Jersey's leading men, had also urged New Jersey to join with the South against the, quote, abolitionist agitators. And the editor of the Newark Journal, Edward Fuller, also agreed with Price and advocated for New Jersey seceding and joining the South. But most New Jerseyans did not wish to secede from the Union. Instead, most New Jerseyans sought energetically to find some sort of compromise before Lincoln took office. The Democratic Party sponsored a state convention that declared all the difficulties between the North and the South were due to abolitionists and endorsed ending, quote, all agitation for the abolition of slavery by guaranteeing forever the rights of the South to its human property. During this period, there was a lot of focus on passing an unamendable amendment to the Constitution, guaranteeing Southern slavery. The democratically controlled legislature also urged forbearance, compromise, and the passage of additional constitutional protections for slavery along the lines suggested by the Democratic State Convention. Although the Republicans in New Jersey were not supportive of additional protections for slavery in the territories, they did favor efforts for peace and supported the National Peace Conference in Washington, D.C. On the issue of the legality of secession, New Jerseyans were divided. Historically, New Jerseyans did tend towards a strict construction of the federal government's powers and were sympathetic towards certain states' rights arguments. Many believed that the South did indeed possess the right to secede. Shortly after the election, the Atlantic Journal of May's Landing wrote the following. If a majority of the people of the southern states desire to withdraw peaceably from the Union and form a separate government of their own, that they have a perfect right to do so, and that the federal government ought not to use any coercive measures to prevent them from carrying out their views. Now, how widespread such views were is difficult to know, but it's clear that the majority of New Jerseyans denied the right of secession and believed that the federal government possessed the legal right to suppress rebellion. In other words, most New Jerseyans, I don't think, agreed with May's Landing here. This was made clear, in my opinion, by the state legislature, even as that body pushed for compromises to avoid war. Denying the legal right to secede is not the same thing as being willing and ready to sacrifice lives of the state's young men and the monies of the taxpayers, though. And in fact, this is the crucial issue, right? In fact, James Buchanan also denied the legal right to secede, but he also said that the federal government would spend no money and sacrifice no lives to stop it, which led William Seward, who would become Secretary of State, to Lincoln to say, this means that the South can't leave unless it really wants to, ridiculing Buchanan's position. In December, the Princeton Press expressed no support for armed resistance to secession, instead urging the North to continue to support the series of compromises on the issue of slavery that would preserve the Union, or at least give Northerners some, quote, melancholy satisfaction of having worked fervently to prevent dissolution. They seem to say we need to give it every shot we can, so that when it falls apart we can at least say we tried hard. That doesn't seem to be a paper that's bracing to send soldiers off to make the South stay in the Union. Okay, so if in fact we know that there's all these folks who are not very excited about war and about force being used and about compelling the South to stay in the Union, how do we explain the fact that when in fact the war did come, New Jerseyans responded to the call for volunteers with enthusiasm, sending thousands and thousands of soldiers eventually to support the war effort? New Jerseyans may not have sacrificed as some other states in terms of the level, but the population was smaller, and on a per capita basis, the price paid by New Jerseyans was still steep. the loss of at least 6,300 soldiers during the Civil War's 4 years. By contrast, just to give you an example, New Jersey lost only 1,484 soldiers during the 10 years of the Vietnam War, a war which divided New Jersey quite fundamentally. The sacrifice paid in the Civil War in a shorter period of time was much greater. So how do you put these two together? Opposition to, seeming opposition to the Lincoln administration and enormous sacrifice that will eventually be given. As with every complex historical event, there are multiple factors at work, including, on the one hand, a deep-seated Jersey blue patriotism that may have been, in fact, part of the state's first silent majority. However, I would also like to highlight the role of Abraham Lincoln, who's been vilified by many in the state before and during the war, but I would like to argue that he was central to New Jersey's solid, if at times grudging, support for the Union war effort. And I want to in particular point out 3 actions by Lincoln that I think went far towards rallying and unifying, especially the moderate New Jerseyans, behind a military response to secession. All right. The first of these 3 acts was a delivery of 2 speeches in Trenton on his way to Washington, D.C. To become president. Okay? And I thought these speeches were interesting, and that probably most of you have never read these speeches. You may be more familiar with the Gettysburg Address and maybe even his inaugural addresses, but not his speeches in Trenton, and I think they're worth reading. I think Lincoln has something to say. Mr. President and gentlemen of the Senate of the State of New Jersey, I am very grateful to you for the honorable reception to which I have been the object. I cannot but remember the place that New Jersey holds in our early history. In the early revolutionary struggle, few of the states among the old 13 had more of the battlefields of the country within their limits than old New Jersey. I remember all the accounts there given of the battlefields and struggles for the liberties of the country, and none fixed themselves upon my imagination so deeply as the struggle here at Trenton, New Jersey. The crossing of the river, the contest with the Hessians, the great hardships endured at that time, all fixed themselves in my memory more than any single revolutionary event, and you all know, for you all have been boys, how these early impressions last longer than any others. So Lincoln, as he is wont to do, starts off with a story, a personal story in this case about himself. But it's not just a randomly chosen story, of course, right? It's connecting the people who he's talking to towards the revolutionary story, right? We all have something in common, a shared history of sacrifice and victory in the revolution, right? Don't forget that. Don't forget the fallen patriots from 1776. I haven't, and I know you haven't either, right? Okay. And then he moves on. I recollect thinking then, boy even though I was, that there must have been something more than common that those men struggled for, that something even more than national independence, that something that held out a great promise to all the people of the world to all time to come. I am exceedingly anxious that this union, the Constitution, and the liberties of the people shall be perpetuated in accordance with the original idea for which that struggle was made. And I shall be most happy indeed if I shall be a humble instrument in the hands of the Almighty, and of this, His almost chosen people, for perpetuating the object of that great struggle. So here, he takes it to the next level. He says, remember the revolution, don't forget that. Then he says, remember that the revolution was not merely for our independence. It was for something else, something deeper. It was for democracy. It was for representative government. That's what they were fighting for. That's what they sacrificed for. Not just mere national independence. Do not degrade what they fought for by merely thinking it was political independence. They fought for something more, right? Then he closes. You give me this reception as I understand without distinction of party. I learned that this body is composed of a majority of gentlemen who in the exercise of their best judgment and the choice of a chief magistrate did not think I was the man. I understand, nevertheless, that they came forward here to greet me as the constitutional president of the United States, as citizens of the United States, to meet the man who for the time being is the representative man of the nation, united by purpose to perpetuate the union and liberties of the people. As such, I accept this reception more gratefully than I could do, did I believe it was tendered to me as an individual. He emphasizes at the end, and I think this is a very important point, and I think it's what makes New Jersey so fascinating to me. Every other northern free state except for New Jersey voted for Lincoln. For them to support Lincoln is no big deal. They wanted Lincoln. He's their man. Their support for Lincoln indicates nothing more than the winner supporting the winner. For New Jerseyans to support Lincoln is actually to prove the principle of democratic government, because the principle of democratic government is that the loser submits to the will of the majority. And it's New Jersey alone that can give Lincoln that among the free states. New Jersey's acceptance of Lincoln is proof that the democratic principle is at work in the United States. Right? Massachusetts' support for Lincoln does not indicate that, because they wanted Lincoln. Only New Jersey can give Lincoln that, and he understands how important that is. I think that's why he stopped and gave 2 speeches in Trenton. He knows it's important that he reach out to those who voted against him, not just in New Jersey, the majority who voted against him, but the 48% that voted against him in other free states in the North. I think Lincoln is very wise in doing this. Although the speeches were well appreciated by the crowds who frequently interrupted Lincoln to give their applause, statewide reaction to Lincoln's speeches predictably split along party lines. In other words, no matter how eloquent Lincoln might be, the people who didn't like him were still not going to like him, and the people who liked him were still going to like him. And unfortunately, that seems to be the way it is for politics all the way down to the present. But anyway, the key is, of course, about the independents, right? As it always is, the moderates, those people in the middle who Lincoln is really talking to. And it seems that the overall impact of Lincoln's visit was positive. It rallied his supporters for sure, appealed to their patriotism and constitutional principles of the moderates at the same time, and also simultaneously avoided anything so provocative on abolition or related matters that it didn't galvanize any further his opponents, right? So I think it was a successful speech. Okay. Let's move on to the second moment that I think Lincoln did great things to reaching out to moderates and independents in the North. This second great act by Lincoln was his first inaugural address. He began this address, which many of you may know, by attempting to assure the South, but really those in the North who feared radical action by the Republicans, that the property, peace, and security of the South was not in any way endangered by the new incoming administration. He then directly refuted the right of secession, argued that the Union was perpetual, and that the actions of the Confederate States were insurrectionary. He said, however, that there was only a single issue that divided the country. One section of our country believes slavery is right and ought to be extended, while the other believes it is wrong and ought not to be extended. Looking to build a broad consensus among Northerners and to hold the teetering allegiance of the border slave states, Lincoln noted that he would pursue a peaceful solution of the national troubles and the restoration of fraternal sympathies and affections. In a magisterial closing, he emphasized this point again. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without yourselves being the aggressors. Lincoln's words, of course, fell on deaf ears in the Confederacy, but they resonated with moderates in the North and the border states. And on that, I think he was successful. Reaction, once again, in New Jersey, fell along party lines. Republicans, such as the editor of the Morristown Jerseyman, loved it, and most Democrats declared it to be no surprise. But the fact that some Democratic papers, such as the Jersey City Standard, said the speech was moderate and indicated that Lincoln did indeed desire to pursue a cautious and peaceful course suggests that Lincoln was actually making some small headway, right? Democratic paper says, I think this speech is we're going to be okay with Lincoln, okay? There's the Morristown Jerseyman's quote. Mr. Lincoln made a very favorable impression here after his talk, okay? All right. The third event that I want to talk about with regard to Lincoln and how he handled things early on as president is the Fort Sumter crisis. As many of you may know, Fort Sumter was a fort in the Charleston Harbor that remained under federal control throughout the actions of its commander, Robert Anderson. While many federal forts were being taken over by Confederates while Buchanan was president, Anderson consolidated and held on to Fort Sumter in the Charleston Harbor. It had become a powerful symbol both in the North and in the South, of secession. Northerners, especially Republicans, lambasted President Buchanan for not resisting Confederate acquisition of federal arms and facilities. They assailed Buchanan for not reinforcing Anderson and his men in Fort Sumter. They expected Lincoln to do better. They expected him to stand up to the South. If Lincoln did not, he would be seen as weak and having broken his word to enforce federal law. However, Lincoln and his Secretary of State were loath to be seen as the ones who started the Civil War by sending military forces into Charleston Harbor. No one in the North agreed on how to proceed. Lincoln's own cabinet was divided. Republican newspapers in New Jersey were divided. No one seemed to know how to handle this crisis. Eventually, Lincoln, over the objections of Democrats and even conservative Republicans, devised what we now know to be a brilliant strategy, although no one knew it was going to work when he came up with it. He was going to send an unarmed ship to ferry supplies to Fort Sumter. He would publicly announce that the ship was coming and that it was not armed. It would bring no soldiers, no ammunition, no guns, just humanitarian supplies for relief. Lincoln hoped that this would provoke the Confederates, however, into firing the first shots of the war and thereby rally moderate and conservative Northerners, like those in New Jersey, to the Union cause. When his decision was first announced, New Jerseyans reacted once again along party lines. Republicans greeting the news with relief that the government was finally doing something, while Democrats believed Lincoln's course was reckless. Lincoln's gamble, however, played out just as he had hoped. The Confederate leadership were in a bind themselves, as so many Southerners believed the continued federal presence in the Charleston Harbor was an affront to their honor. In fact, Jefferson Davis knew that he could not continue to hold off on action for long, because if he didn't, local Charlestonians would take matters into their own hands and fire on the fort anyway. And then he would have gained nothing except losing Confederate power, central power. So he had to give the order. He gave that order on the 12th of April, 1861, before Lincoln's supply ship could arrive, and the Civil War began. Yeah. All right. Reaction to Fort Sumter in New Jersey. It played out pretty much exactly as Lincoln had hoped. New Jersey is in fact one of the greatest examples of Lincoln's successful handling of the crisis. Although the majority had voted against him for president, they now rallied to the Union and to his call to put down those rebels that had dared fire upon the flag. In May, the Mount Holly Herald wrote that the Democratic Party is a unit for the Union and the Constitution. This is not the political division that we've seen just days before Fort Sumter. Fierce critics of Lincoln and the Republicans now became major supporters of the war effort. One such convert was Charles Deschler, editor of the Jersey City Standard, who wrote after Fort Sumter that, quote, "No measure of compromise should be for a moment entertained which in the remotest degree admits the right of succession or a willingness for a peaceful dissolution of the Union." Okay? The best evidence of New Jersey's new attitude towards the crisis can be seen, however, in the state's response to Lincoln's call for volunteers to put down the rebellion. That same call led to bitter responses from the border slave states, for example, right? So if you're trying to argue that New Jersey is like a border slave state, let's check out what the governor of Kentucky said when Lincoln asked Kentucky for soldiers. He said, "I say emphatically, Kentucky will provide no troops for the wicked purpose of subduing her sister states." And Kentucky provided no troops and tried to continue to remain neutral. The response from New Jersey was quite different and placed them squarely with their fellow free states. Governor Charles Olden, who you see here, acted quickly on Lincoln's request and asked the state legislature to authorize $2 million for the war effort and promised to great applause that New Jersey will meet the crisis and rise to the height of her great duty, ever standing firm by the Union. The legislature complied, although there were some Democratic opposition, and 4,000 volunteers came forward very quickly to respond to Lincoln's request. By the end of the war, New Jersey had contributed approximately 88,000 soldiers to the war effort, a very substantial total for a state with a modest population before the Civil War. Hello, how you doing?
Just wanted him to get a seat.
No problem. Happy to have him get a seat. Okay, so those are some images of New Jersey volunteers, those who fought for the United States during the war. The first regiments that volunteered formed the 1st New Jersey Brigade, and these are survivors of the brigade in front of a memorial that was created later. They volunteered for a whole variety of reasons, right? Some of it was just youthful high spirits. They didn't really know what they were getting into. It was exciting. They wanted to be part of a war. Let's go. It's going to be cool. I want to get into it before it gets over. A lot of these folks thought the war was going to be over in 90 days. They were worried they weren't going to get into the war before it was over. They would have lots of opportunity, as it turns out. Other was honor and community pressure, that this was the patriotic thing to do, and if you didn't have a good excuse, what were you doing here? You know, you're a man of a young man. This is what young men of your age do. You don't have a job. I mean, get out there. You know, so a lot of pressure was put on certain people to volunteer as well. And then, of course, just people who had an inner core belief that it was their duty, their patriotic duty, to support their government. But the last one I want to emphasize as being very important. If you look at the letters of these soldiers, and this is true of New Jersey soldiers as well as soldiers from other northern states, they do talk about more than just these kind of simple patriotic things. Many of them also talk about the idea of the Union. They are not unaware that the principle of majority rule is at stake, right? They believe that it is not merely the question of the southern states becoming independent and 2 nations. They believe that secession is a direct attack on Republican government itself. Because what they say is that we had a government, we had an election according to the Constitution. Lincoln won fair and square. Southerners don't allege any improper voting. They just simply don't like the result. And when the loser leaves because they don't like the result of an election, that is anarchy, that is destruction of majority rule. And I think most New Jerseyans volunteered on that basis, that they thought not only was the Union at stake, in other words, the political union of the states, but more than that was at stake. As Lincoln had suggested, it was the very idea of Republican government, which you have to understand at this point in history is not widely emulated throughout the rest of the world. What other parts of the world have representative government? England, sort of. Queen Victoria is still in charge. I mean, it's a pretty democratic government in England. Napoleon III is in charge of France. Definitely wouldn't call that a democratic government. Nowhere else in the world. I mean, the United States is still relatively alone in this experiment in democracy. In fact, there were many people who thought democracy was a foolish idea, who looked at the Civil War and laughed and mocked the United States. They said, see, we told you this wasn't going to last. Just like in Rome and just like in Greece, it was doomed to fail. It was a great, wonderful, noble idea, but it never can work. Monarchy, dictatorship, strong authoritarian rule is necessary for most humans. And that's the way it is. And they laughed and they said, there are men who were born before the American Republic began, and they will live to see it end. Right? That's what they said. It only was 72 years old. So New Jerseyans are volunteering, in my opinion, because they don't want that experiment to fail. They believe that's what their fathers, grandfathers fought for at the Revolution, and that's what they are going off to war to save. Not going off to make sure Alabama stays in the Union. They really could care less about an Alabama farmer, but they care a lot about Republican government, majority rule, and that's why they go off to fight. Not every one of them. Not every one of them. Some of them, I'm sure, couldn't articulate it that well. And maybe they're going off to think it'll be a lot of fun, and when they come home with a uniform on, the girls will like them a little bit better. I'm not saying that everyone takes it as seriously as that, but a lot do, and that matters. Okay. I want to talk about New Jersey's most famous soldier, and that is General Philip Kearny. He's commander of the 1st Brigade. He was born in New York, His family was one of the wealthiest in the United States. They had a nice mansion in New York, but he moved out after divorcing his first wife, moved to Belgrove, New Jersey, where he said he sought to escape the tongues of New York, which were giving him a lashing after his divorce. He entered the military instead of leading a life of luxury. He was so rich, he could have lived a life of leisure and never worked a day in his life, but instead he entered the military. He served in the war with Mexico where he was wounded, and he had to have his arm amputated, as you can tell. He returned to service despite that injury and was the first soldier to enter Mexico City. He so loved war that he actually couldn't go into civilian life in the 1850s, and even fighting the Indians out west wasn't exciting enough for him, so he actually went to France and fought with the French against the Austrians, where he became the first U.S. citizen to be given the highest honor that the French give to a non-Frenchman for his service against the Austrians. When the Civil War broke out, he returned to New Jersey, was put in charge of the 1st New Jersey Brigade, which was the only Union brigade to be composed solely of New Jersey soldiers. And that brigade would end up fighting in almost all of the battles of the Eastern Theater. It had some small amount at First Bull Run, all the way up through Gettysburg, Cold Harbor, Spotsylvania, all the way pretty much to the end. The unity that emerged after the firing on Fort Sumter and had led to the formation of the 1st New Jersey Brigade was unfortunately not destined to endure. 4 months after Fort Sumter, on July the 21st, 1861, the Union Army was routed at the Battle of First Bull Run. This disastrous defeat with 5,000 casualties spread a sense of doom and defeatism in New Jersey and gave new encouragement to opponents of the war and the Lincoln administration. Pessimism engulfed the soldiers themselves, with some worrying that all was lost and that the government was ruined. The Newark Journal wrote that the North is destined to sure defeat. Peace meetings took place across New Jersey. From this point forward, New Jerseyans would find themselves divided on the war, and they would never recapture the unity that they had after Fort Sumter. We'll pick up the story of how New Jersey got through this difficult period of division next week. Thank you, everybody. I'm happy to take questions if anyone has a question for me.
I thought you were going to the start of the Civil War and just is that all it was slavery?
The causes of the Civil War. Question about the causes of the Civil War. Lincoln said that the cause of the Civil War was slavery. The Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, said that the cause of the Civil War was slavery. However, Alexander Stephens, he said that in 1861. In 1866, Alexander Stephens said slavery had nothing to do with the coming of the Civil War. In my opinion, the coming of the Civil War is a complicated thing for absolutely certain. But no slavery, no Civil War, in my opinion. I think the principal difficulties in understanding this, and why I have relatives and people who fly Confederate flags and they say heritage, not hate, and all this kind of stuff. And I think what gets them off track is that they have ancestors who didn't own slaves and who fought for the Confederacy, and they say, my ancestors didn't fight for slavery, it wasn't about slavery. But unfortunately, why soldiers fight is not why wars begin. We are just finished up a war in Iraq, which illustrates that very clearly. We went to war in Iraq because lots of people, lots of smart people, believed they had weapons of mass destruction. It wasn't just Colin Powell, it wasn't just George W. Bush, it was Bill Clinton, it was Tony Blair. That's why we went to Iraq. If we would have known they would have had no weapons of mass destruction, I don't think we would have gone to war. But once we went there, we found out, oh, no weapons of mass destruction, we didn't pull out. At that point, the mission changed. It became stabilizing Iraq. We were there. Democracy, a lot of different things that it changed. Soldiers continued to volunteer even after they knew there was no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Why the soldiers stayed in Iraq, why they went back to Iraq, why they went back for additional tours, had nothing to do with the cause of the Iraq War. Nothing, right? Had nothing to do with the cause of the war. The cause of the war is not why soldiers fight. If you can separate these two things, I think you can get at easier why people get upset about this, slavery being the cause of the Civil War. I used to go through and try to tell you it's very complicated. There are all these people that, you know, they were states' rights, they did believe in states' rights, and that was important to them. But in the end, slavery, and I would go through all this kind of stuff, and my students would say, Dr. Carrigan said slavery was not the cause of the war. And I would go, ah! And I said, okay, repeat after me. Slavery is the cause of the Civil War. Because, you know, it's great if you can have a nuanced understanding of what happened. But if at the expense of the nuance you end up saying slavery was not the key factor, you're wrong. Now, there are many different explanations for why slavery caused the war, which historians don't agree upon. Was it because slavery as a moral issue? Northerners who thought slavery was wrong, Southerners who thought slavery was right, as Lincoln suggested. Well, some people believe that, but not all historians. Some people say slavery as an economic factor was more important, that in fact, you know, it was an economic issue that was really underneath and motivating this conflict between the two powers. Others emphasize kind of cultural factors, that Northerners and Southerners, because of all the fighting over slavery, had come to really despise each other, that, you know, decades of kind of being in odds politically with one another had led them to kind of just feel that the other was alien and you know, someone they didn't want to spend any more time with. Now, I would argue they never would have got to that point if it hadn't been for slavery. But that doesn't mean that, you know, the person's decision or vote in 1860 is because of a particular, you know, issue related to slavery. But I'm arguing they never would have got to hate Northerners or New Englanders if it hadn't been for this constant conflict over the previous 40 years. So there's a number of different ways you can say why exactly slavery caused war. You can also say westward expansion. You know, the fact that we kept on acquiring territory in the West, and that seemed to be the issue that would bring up this controversy all the time. It wasn't so much what to do with slavery in Georgia as it was what to do with slavery in Kansas. And if maybe we wouldn't have had westward expansion, maybe we wouldn't have had the Civil War. But I would argue that if we had no slavery, we could have had westward expansion just fine. But it was slavery, not westward expansion, that caused the conflict. But, you know, so you understand how it's a complicated thing. But ultimately, I think if you take slavery out, I think you don't have a civil war. There's so much that we had in common. So much North and South. I mean, they were almost all Protestant Christians with a tiny sprinkling of Catholics. They all spoke English. Do you know how rare it is, even in this day and age, for a people so spread out to speak the same language? I mean, it's not true in Europe. It's not true in China. It's not true in, you know, it's true in Spanish America. It's still rare. So we had a lot in common, a shared revolutionary heritage, multiple wars against England. I mean, there was a lot in common that we had. That those commonalities would be overcome, it doesn't seem that those would be overcome by a mere constitutional principle. It doesn't seem that way to me. That's my belief. So, anyway, Alice, you have a question?
After the war was over, did many of the slaves stay on plantations and work for money?
They worked for shares of the crop. Southerners had no money left. If they would have wanted to pay them money, they could not have because they were bankrupt. The only way that you could have established a wage labor economy in the South would have been for the federal government to fund it. The Southerners were bankrupt, couldn't do it. So what happened is kind of a compromise solution, whereas the planters still had land. They would allow their slaves to work, former slaves to work part of the land, and they would get part of the crop. They would share the crop. It wasn't a very efficient system. Wages actually would have been better for the Southern economy, but they didn't have any money to pay wages. Yes?
One comment, one question. The comment is that I find it very interesting that North Jersey had more slaves than South Jersey, because with the agriculture that we currently have in South Jersey, I would have thought the reverse would be true. The question is, I heard a few years ago that when Lincoln ran for president, both for the first time and the second time, that New Jersey legislature changed the rules for the electoral college and allowed the delegates to the electoral college to split their votes instead of having the state go all 100% for one person. Is that correct?
Yeah, I believe that is true. I don't know about 1864. Maybe it was also true in 1864, but I think it is true in 1860 that they elected some of these electors, and that actually was part of their problem. They didn't pull that off. They were trying to do that, so they were trying to get these ballots, which were like, you can vote for anybody that you want kind of ballots, and they messed up. And so some people got those ballots, and some people got the other ballots. So what happened is that they voted for the wrong elector. They voted for a Douglas elector, but that Douglas elector was different than the other Douglas elector. So even though they both voted for Douglas, they voted for two different electors, and therefore that's why Lincoln was able to get those electoral votes, because Douglas had all these votes, but he had the split in the crazy voting for these two different electors to the Electoral College. So they did try that. It was a boondoggle, though, so it didn't really work out for them.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Carroll.
Oh, one more question here. You got another question yet?
Yeah. Without Abe Lincoln or the Civil War, or either or both, would slavery had eventually died out peacefully?
Eventually, yes, but I think you're talking way, way, way in the future. Not nearly what people think it is. It lasted if the United States, which was the largest slave power in the world, right? It had more slaves than any other country in the world. If the United States would have maintained slavery, that would have, I think, lengthened the history of slavery in the rest of the world, right? In other words, when the largest slave power goes down, then I think the other slave powers are starting to feel even more pressure to get rid of slavery. Despite that, Brazil had slavery until 1889 and Cuba until 1888. I think they would have had slavery longer if the United States would have been able to hold on to it. Slavery in 1860 was as profitable, in fact probably more profitable than ever before. Slavery was not an inefficient labor system for agricultural work that the South was doing. Yes, I think the modern world was moving away from slavery, but I don't know when it was going to happen. In my opinion, if you look back, and despite the victory of the North in the Civil War, I don't think the trend in world history is actually towards egalitarianism, or equality, civil rights, or even Republican government. I really think that the trajectory is actually towards increased racism and discrimination all the way up through World War II. I actually think, when the South seceded, they, in my opinion, had a stronger, more racist position than Thomas Jefferson did. Thomas Jefferson said slavery was an evil. He said it was morally wrong and that God wanted us to get rid of it. He said, I just don't know how. How can we make money? How can we continue without slavery? It's a wolf by the ears, he said. He thought it was wrong. He said in his writings, nothing is more clearly written in the book of faith than that these people shall be free. In 1861, the South said Thomas Jefferson was totally wrong. Our government rests upon the cornerstone that the African is not equal to the European. That is the foundation of our government. That is a long way from the Jeffersonian view. And I would argue that despite that strong statement of white supremacy, that the South was more racist in the 1890s when it was lynching African Americans all over the place than it was in the 1860s. It was a different form of racism, more violent than the paternalistic kind in the 1860s. Both were certainly, believed whites were superior. But anyway, I think you go all the way up through the Nazis. I do not see the world embracing egalitarianism, universalism during this period. I see the rise of kind of science and Darwinism and those kinds of things actually enforcing racial views. So I think it's hard to speculate. I think eventually yes. But I am not one of those people who think it would have been over soon. It was over in 1865 with the Civil War. It would have been over in 1872 or 1875. I'm not one of those people. I think you're talking about the 20th century. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yep. Absolutely. A pleasure. Happy to do it. I'll stick around for any individual questions that you might have, and I'll be back here next week at 6:30.